On July 1943, a B-17 crew from England faced a deadly problem. Their bomber was easy prey for German fighters. One mechanic's odd idea painting a cow pattern on the plane seemed foolish. But that stupid paint job made the B-17 unkillable in the skies over Nazi Germany. In spring 1943, at an airbase in England, B-17 crews prepared for another day over Nazi-occupied Europe. The war had settled into a harsh rhythm. Long hours on the ground, brief bursts of danger in the air. The sky often felt empty, but the threat of enemy fighters was never far. Oil and fuel hung heavy in the cool morning air. Mechanics worked with hands cracked and stained dark from grease. One mechanic stood staring at a battered B-17 parked on the field. Its metal skin was peppered with bullet holes and shrapnel scars from previous missions. The crews joked quietly among themselves. They spoke of luck running thin. Many wondered how long their luck would hold in combat. Each mission could be their last. The mechanic, tired and overlooked, picked up a paintbrush. Without saying a word, he started painting irregular black spots across the bomber's dull gray surface. The shape looked like a cow. Soon others noticed and laughter spread across the base. The cow-painted B became a brief distraction from the tension. It lightened the mood before the next dangerous flight. When the squadron took off on their next sortie, the cow bomber was among them. Hours later, it returned alone and untouched. No bullet holes. No damage. The base fell silent. The joke stopped. The laughter faded. Pilots and crew noticed the difference immediately. This unexpected survival shifted the mood at the airfield. It sparked questions about how and why that B-17 came back whole, when so many others returned riddled with holes. The story was about to begin. A story that would change how the crews saw their aircraft, their tactics, and their chance to survive the deadly air war over Europe. Dawn broke over the airfield on March 17, 1944. The sky was pale gray, cold. The 91st Bomb Group moved quietly among the rows of planes. Their B-17, Elsie, stood battered on the tarmac, her paint chipped and scarred from recent missions. Men shuffled toward their aircraft. Their eyes were swollen from little sleep. Faces showed the toll of constant danger. The noise of engines revving in the distance grew louder. The mission clock was counting down. A mechanic dragged his toolbox under the belly of Elsie. His hands were steady, but his eyes scanned every dent and scratch. The bomber had taken flak hits over Leipzig the day before. The crew had complained about the damage and the slim odds of returning safely on the next run. The mechanic listened without speaking. His mind focused on the plane and the weight of what was to come. Nearby, a tin of leftover white paint caught his eye. It was a small can, almost forgotten. He thought about how the paint might cover the scars, or maybe even hide the plane a little better. The idea began to form. One of the pilots passed by and noticed the mechanic eyeing the paint. "You planning to paint Elsie like a circus animal?" he joked with a rough laugh. The laughter was brief and hollow. The day's mission orders were posted on the bulletin board. The men gathered around in silence. The targets were deep inside Germany. Enemy fighters, heavy flak, and low survival rates were expected. The mechanic stayed by the plane a moment longer. His hands rested on the cool metal skin of Elsie. The bomber's frame was strong but fragile under the relentless stress of combat. Fear hung heavy in the air. Not just the fear of death, but the fear of failing those who trusted the crew and the plane. The mechanic knew every mission was a gamble with fate. The men moved into their positions, checking guns and equipment. The engines began to roar. The ground shook as the formation prepared to take off. In that moment, the mechanic's quiet resolve was clear. He would do what he could to keep Elsie flying. The paint was more than just a cover. It was a small hope in a war measured by losses. The mission would test them all. But for now, the mechanic worked silently, hands steady, ready for what came next. Inside the hangar, the mechanic picked up a paintbrush and dipped it first into a can of white paint. The brush moved steadily across the wing of the fighter aircraft known as Elsie. After covering broad patches in white, he switched to black paint. Slowly, black spots appeared over the white areas on the wings and fuselage. The pattern looked like cow spots across the plane's surface. Mechanics and gunners passed by, their footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. They noticed the unusual paint job and began to whisper among themselves. Some pointed at the aircraft and snickered. One of the gunners shouted, "You trying to get her shot down or milked?" The comment drew a few laughs, but the mechanic did not respond. His jaw was tight. He kept painting the irregular black spots despite the mocking. The crew chief approached and stopped beside the mechanic. The chief shook his head slowly but said nothing. He allowed the mechanic to finish the job. The paint looked sloppy and uneven. The edges of the spots were rough, and the shapes were almost childish in appearance. This was no professional camouflage job. The marks seemed out of place on a fighter meant for combat. Sunlight filtered through the hangar windows and glinted off the fresh paint. The contrast between the black spots and the white background made Elsie stand out even more. The metal surface reflected the light sharply, drawing more attention to the strange pattern. The mechanic paused after finishing the last spot. He wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. The air in the hangar was thick and warm. The smell of paint mixed with oil and engine fuel. He stood back and waited silently. The crew was gathering nearby, ready to assess the finished work. One of the gunners stepped forward and ran his hand along the wing. "It looks like a cow," he said bluntly. Several others nodded, some still chuckling quietly. The crew chief looked at the plane with narrowed eyes, but said nothing. The mechanic's face remained motionless. He knew the paint job was risky. It made the plane more visible in the air. Enemy fighters could spot Elsie more easily now. But the mechanic had a reason for painting the cow spots. This was not about camouflage. It was about something else. The crew chief finally spoke. "It's not what we're used to," he said. "But if it helps the pilot stay sharp or keeps the crew's spirit up, maybe it's worth it." The other men listened. The mood was serious now. They understood the mechanic's intent was not careless. The mechanic nodded slightly. "It's a reminder," he said quietly, "about how dangerous every mission is, and how we need to watch out for each other." The crew exchanged looks. They had been flying Elsie on dangerous patrols. The plane had survived close calls. The new paint was a symbol, not just decoration. The cow spots made Elsie unique in the squadron. Other fighters had standard markings and serial numbers. This plane now carried a mark of honor and caution. It reminded the crew of their duty and the risks they faced daily. In the hangar, the crew gathered around the plane. They checked supplies and weapons, preparing for the next mission. The mechanic stood nearby, watching their faces. The paint on Elsie caught their attention again and again. It was impossible to ignore. The new look sparked quiet conversations. Pilots joked lightly about flying a cow into battle. But underneath, the humor was respect. They knew flying Elsie required skill and courage. The paint was a constant reminder of that fact. The sun continued to shine through the windows, casting sharp shadows across the floor. The black and white spots on the plane contrasted with the gray hangar walls. It was a strange sight in a place of hard work and preparation. The mechanic cleaned his brushes carefully after finishing. The smell of fresh paint lingered in the air. He looked once more at Elsie, knowing the plane would soon take to the skies again. The paint job was a small act of defiance against the dangers ahead. In the war, every detail mattered. A paint job could be more than appearance. It could be a message, a warning, or a symbol. For Elsie and her crew, the cow spots meant all of these things. The plane was ready. The mechanic stepped back and joined the others. The team was united by this quiet reminder. In the coming battles, it would guide them. Elsie was no ordinary fighter now. The paint made that clear. It stood out in the squadron, just as the crew planned. The mechanics' work was done. The mission was about to continue. The risks were real, but so was their honor. And Elsie wore that honor proudly. On the morning of the mission, the crew of the B-17 known as Elsie gathered around their bomber. The aircraft looked different painted, with a large black and white cow pattern across the fuselage. The transformation was meant to confuse enemy gunners and boost morale, but it drew mixed reactions. The pilot, Captain Reynolds, stood by the cockpit door. He laughed at the bizarre paint job, but nodded when asked if he would fly the plane. "She looks ugly, but she flies like any other B-17, he said. The crew took it as a good sign. Other bomber crews nearby noticed the cow-painted plane. They started joking and placing bets on whether the cow would return safely from the mission. Some called it a flying joke. Others thought it was reckless. Sergeant Harris, the chief mechanic, stood apart from the group. His arms were folded tightly across his chest. He didn't join the laughter or bets. Instead, he watched the plane with quiet tension. He knew every bolt, every engine detail, and the risks ahead. His anxiety was hidden behind a calm face. At 07:15, the engines roared to life. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone radial engines began spinning, each producing 1,200 horsepower. The drone of the engine spread across the airfield. Crew members moved quickly, checking final systems and securing gear. The cow-painted bomber started rolling down the run. The ground crew held their breath as it gained speed. At 110 miles per hour, the B-17 began to lift off the tarmac. The landing gear retracted, and the bomber climbed steadily into the sky. A sudden hush fell over the ground crew watching. The familiar sound of the engines faded as the plane gained altitude. The bomber became smaller and smaller against the gray morning sky. Some ground crew members shook their heads in disbelief. Others crossed themselves, hoping for the crew's safe return. The superstition was real. Many had lost friends in these raids. The uncertain fate of the cow weighed heavily. Sergeant Harris did not move. His eyes stayed fixed as the bomber became a tiny speck above the run. He knew the mechanical risks, the enemy fighters, and the flak waiting over the target. Despite his fear, he trusted the plane he had built and maintained. The cow paint was intended as a morale booster and a symbol of defiance. But for many, it was a strange sight on a plane built for war, not whimsy. The mission was dangerous, and every detail mattered. The crew climbed to cruising altitude, around 20,000 feet, preparing for the long flight over enemy territory. The bomber needed to maintain tight formation for protection. Flak and fighters would test their resolve. The pilot's voice came over the radio, "Ready to go. Let's bring her home." It was a quiet command, but carried the weight of honor and survival. The crew strapped in, knowing every moment could be their last. The mechanic's role was not finished. Until the plane was safely back on the ground, he carried the responsibility for its performance. The tension on the field reflected the risk each mission carried. This moment captured the mix of hope and fear typical of bomber crews. The painted cow was more than a joke. It represented the crew's determination. They faced death with courage and honor. The B-17 disappeared behind clouds. The ground crew slowly resumed their work, but the image of the cow bomber stayed in their minds. It was a symbol of resilience in a brutal war. The mission had begun. The fate of Elsie and her crew would soon be decided over enemy skies. On April 17, 1943, a B-17 bomber nicknamed Elsie flew deep into enemy airspace over Germany. The sky was filled with black smoke and bursts of flak exploding all around. Flak or anti-aircraft artillery was the constant threat. It shredded the air and could tear an aircraft apart in seconds. Elsie held position at the edge of the bomber formation, a risky spot with limited protection. German fighters approached from above and behind. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s circled the formation, searching for a weak spot. They spotted Elsie. The bomber's unusual paint job made it stand out. It was meant to confuse the enemy, but instead it drew attention. The fighters hesitated. They circled but did not immediately attack. The strange camouflage created uncertainty. German pilots radioed back and forth, unsure how to engage this unfamiliar target. For several tense minutes, Elsie remained under close watch but untouched. Meanwhile, radio chatter crackled inside the formation. Other bombers called in emergency reports. One crew reported a direct flak hit near the wing. Another radioed fire in the engine room. The losses mounted rapidly. 3 bombers had already fallen. The pressure on Elsie's crew grew. They knew their turn might come at any moment. Inside Elsie, the 6 crew members braced for the worst. The pilot kept steady on course and altitude, 25,000 feet above the ground. The bombardier checked his instruments. The navigator confirmed their position. The tail gunner stayed alert, scanning the skies behind. Seconds felt like minutes. Explosions shook the bomber as flak burst nearby. The plane rattled but stayed intact. The crew held their positions, ready to fight. The tail gunner's eyes widened as he saw the fighters close in, but then pull away. "They're not firing," he muttered to himself. His fingers tightened around the trigger of his twin .50 caliber machine guns. He was ready, but the enemy held back. As they reached the target, the ball-bearing factory at Schweinfurt, the bombardier took over. He lined up the bomb site carefully, compensating for wind and speed. At an altitude of 24,500 feet, the bombs weighed down the bomber's nose as they released the payload. Explosions erupted on the ground below. The factory was hit, disrupting German production. This strike was crucial. Ball bearings were vital for German tanks, planes, and vehicles. Every hit slowed the enemy's war machine. With bombs away, the return flight began. The crew remained on high alert. German fighters often attacked stragglers on the way back, looking for damaged planes. Elsie flew through the same flak bursts, but no hits came their way. The bomber's engines roared steadily. The unusual paint job, once a target for curiosity, may have confused the enemy enough to save the crew. The strange camouflage had turned into a kind of shield. After 45 minutes over hostile territory, Elsie reached friendly airspace. The tension inside eased, but did not dissipate. The crew exchanged looks of disbelief. They had made it back untouched. No bullet holes, no wounded men, no engine fires. The mission was a success against all odds. In combat, seconds decided life or death. For Elsie, those seconds passed without a single enemy shot landing. The math didn't add up for the German fighters, and that hesitation saved a crew and a plane. Yet the fear remained. The crew knew their luck could run out any day. Honor drove them forward, the duty to complete the mission and protect each other. Elsie's flight over Schweinfurt showed that sometimes, courage and a bit of confusion could outmatch deadly enemy firepower. The bomber's survival was a rare moment amid heavy losses. As they landed, the crew quietly reflected on what had happened. In the sky over Germany, flak and fighters were constant killers. But today, Elsie had flown through the storm and lived. The bomber didn't change. The tactics and a strange paint job did. And that difference meant survival. Elsie touched down on the dusty airstrip just before dusk. The big twin-engine bomber rolled to a stop. Not a scratch marred its patched cow-pattern paint. The ground crew rushed forward, eyes wide, mouths half open. Inside, the crew climbed out slowly, still shocked. Their faces were pale, hands trembling. The pilots from nearby aircraft crowded around immediately. They wanted to know what had happened in the sky. The mechanic stayed to the side, leaning against the worn wooden hangar. He tried to look casual, but his heart hammered beneath the oil-stained shirt. The others surrounded the pilot, who began to speak. "The Germans came in fast, circling us overhead," he said. They were ready to strike, but when they saw the cow paint, something changed. The group looked skeptical. One pilot interrupted, "You're saying the paint stopped enemy fighters?" "Not stopped," the pilot answered. They hesitated. That extra second gave us time to react. Another pilot shook his head. Sounds like luck. Maybe, the first pilot said. But twice the fighters pulled away. They didn't press the attack. The mechanic finally spoke, voice low. We painted Elsie like that to confuse the enemy, but I never thought it would work this well. The men exchanged glances. The cow pattern was unusual for a bomber, especially in a combat zone. It stood out against the plain gray of other planes. The pilot continued. They circled us at 6,000 feet and below, but never dove in. They looked, then peeled off one by one. The others listened carefully. You think the pattern made them second-guess their targets? It's the only difference, the pilot said. Maybe it made them think this was a decoy or a trick. The mechanic smiled faintly. Some call it luck. Others call it a miracle. The crowd quieted. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the tarmac. We all know luck runs out, someone said, but today it held. The pilot nodded. The Germans never made it past the hesitation. That hesitation saved us. The mechanic's eyes flickered with pride. He had spent hours mixing paint, brushing every inch of the bomber. He wasn't a pilot, but today his work had mattered. Around them, the base was returning to normal. Engines warmed up for night sorties, radios crackled with orders, and men prepared for the next mission. But Elsie was different now. She wasn't just another bomber. She was a symbol of survival. The pilot looked at his crew. We walked away with no holes, no fires, no losses. One of the other pilots muttered, "That's almost unheard of." The mechanic shrugged. Maybe it wasn't just the paint. Maybe it was us. Silence fell for a moment. The tension from the mission lingered in the air. Fear had been close, but honor and skill had brought them through. The pilot glanced upward, toward the darkening sky. Tomorrow, the fight starts again. But for now, Elsie was safe. The pattern that seemed strange to some had become their shield. The mechanic wiped his hands on his pants. We'll keep her like this. If it works, why change it? The others nodded. The story would spread. The cow paint was no longer just a joke. It was a tactic. The pilot summed it up simply. In combat, hesitation can mean life or death. Today, it meant life. The men began to disperse, preparing for rest. But the story stayed with them. Elsie had landed without a scratch. The crew was still stunned. The tactic had saved them. And on that airfield, under the fading light, pride burned quietly in every eye. The next morning, High Command arrived at the airfield. Senior officers stepped out of their staff cars, their boots crunching on the gravel. They moved directly toward the cow-painted B-17, nicknamed Elsie. The aircraft stood out sharply among the drab gray bombers. Its black and white patterns covered the fuselage and tail. The officers inspected the plane closely. One ran a hand over the painted spots. Another checked the cockpit windows and gun turrets. They exchanged skeptical looks. The crew gathered nearby, tense but silent. The mechanic who had applied the paint stood waiting. The highest-ranking officer spoke first. Explain the reasoning behind this paint job, he demanded. This isn't a decoration contest. We have a war to win. The crew chief stepped forward. Sir, the idea was to confuse the enemy. The cow pattern breaks up the shape. It's harder to spot from a distance. The mechanic added, some of us thought it might be good luck too. A kind of superstition. After all, this plane's been lucky so far. The officers exchanged doubtful glances. One barked, superstition won't win battles. The mechanic held his ground. Yes, sir. But the plane has survived more missions than most. Maybe there's something in it. The senior officers paused. They had to acknowledge the record. Elsie had flown 25 missions without a major hit. Most other B-17s on base had suffered serious damage or lost crew members. One officer muttered, "The math doesn't lie. This plane's results speak louder than paint." The base commander spoke next. "We can't officially approve this. It breaks uniform regulations. But the morale boost is real. Other crews are asking for similar paint jobs." He looked around at the gathered bomber pilots and crewmen. Many nodded, some grinned. The cow pattern was becoming a symbol. The mechanic was called forward again. "You will repaint this plane standard gray. No exceptions. Discipline is essential," the commander ordered. The mechanic nodded but did not move. "Understood, sir. I just need a few days to gather materials and prepare." The commander frowned. "Don't delay. This needs to happen immediately." The mechanic stepped back, stalling for time. "Yes, sir. The weather's been rough. The paint won't adhere properly. It's better to wait for a clear day." The officer scowled but had no immediate reply. The mechanic's delay bought precious hours. The base commander looked conflicted. "We must maintain order. But we cannot ignore results. The cow-painted B-17 has proven itself." He turned toward the gathered crew. "For now, Elsie stays as is. But understand, this is a temporary exception." Other crews began discussing painting their own bombers with disruptive patterns. The idea spread quietly but swiftly. The officers finished their inspection and left the airfield. The mechanic lingered by Elsie, checking the paint's condition. He knew the reprieve might not last. In combat, every advantage counted. If paint could confuse enemy gunners, it was worth testing. Discipline clashed with innovation. The base commander's hesitation showed the tension between order and survival. The cow pattern on Elsie was more than paint. It was a symbol of hope and defiance. The mechanic's stalling bought time. Time for crews to believe in something new. The war demanded results. Elsie had delivered. The question remained, could breaking the rules deliver victory? Rumors began to spread quickly through the airfields and forward bases. The Unkillable cow became a legend among the pilots. This nickname referred to the heavily damaged P-47 Thunderbolt that had survived dozens of missions without being lost. Word reached nearby units by early 1944, stirring curiosity and hope. Pilots from other squadrons started visiting the base to see the aircraft for themselves. They wanted to inspect the paintwork, the battle scars, and understand what made it so tough. Some tried to copy the unique black and white cow pattern on their own planes. It became a symbol of endurance and defiance. The mechanic who maintained the Thunderbolt quietly embraced this new role. He began mixing fresh paint, experimenting with variations of the cow pattern for other aircraft in the squadron. This small act gave the unit a subtle but meaningful boost in morale. It was a way to take the edge off the constant danger. Men started joking about painting cows on their helmets or gear. It became a running gag that broke tension before missions. The humor was dry and low-key, but it helped keep spirits up. The Unkillable cow was no longer just an aircraft. It was a shared symbol of survival. Despite the jokes, a persistent fear remained beneath the surface. Every sortie faced serious threats from flak, enemy fighters, and mechanical failure. Each mission was a gamble on survival. The cow paint pattern acted as a talisman, a small comfort against the randomness of death. The pilots understood the reality. The Thunderbolt wasn't literally unkillable. It had taken damage that would have downed most other fighters. But it had also benefited from skilled flying and quick repairs. The paint gave the crew a sense of control amid the chaos. This quiet confidence spread through the squadron. It helped them face missions with steadier nerves. The mechanic's work on the paint was more than cosmetic. It was a mental shield against the fear that came with every takeoff. The cow pattern became a unit-wide emblem of toughness and resilience. It reminded the men that they could endure, even when the odds were against them. It was honor in paint form, a visual promise to keep fighting. At the same time, the humor and the paint concealed a hard truth. The war was far from over. Losses continued, and the threat remained constant. The pattern was a protection against despair, not a guarantee of safety. The unkillable cow legend grew with each mission flown, each encounter survived. For some, it was a superstition. For others, a practical sign of the Thunderbolt's rugged design and its crew's skill. In the background of every joke and every fresh coat of paint was the reality of combat. Pilots knew that survival depended on quick decisions, flying skill, and sometimes luck. The mechanic's quiet labor went on, mixing black and white paint in the dusty hangar. His work gave the aircraft new life before each mission. The paint was more than decoration. It was a mark of honor and a quiet defiance against fate. In combat, every small edge mattered. The cow paint became that edge for this squadron. The story of the unkillable cow spread beyond the base. It brought together men who faced the same dangers every day. The paint linked them, turning fear into a shared symbol of endurance. As the war dragged on, the cow pattern remained a steady presence. It stood for the toughness of the Thunderbolt and the honor of the men who flew it. Beneath the humor and paint, the fear stayed, but so did the will to survive. In the end, the unkillable cow was more than a plane. It was a living symbol of courage under fire and the quiet determination of those who faced death every day in the skies over Europe. On a gray morning in late 1944, the bomber group prepared for another mission over enemy territory. This time, the lead plane was Elsie, a B-17 flying fortress with a reputation for toughness and survival. Clouds had thickened, turning the sky into a patchwork of shadows. Visibility dropped to a few hundred feet. The formation's cowling spots, the white circles on the planes, noses glimmered faintly in the gloom. The mission was straightforward: reach the target, drop the bombs, and get back. But the weather made flying tricky. The clouds hid enemy fighters until they were dangerously close. The formation's tight spacing was meant to protect them, but it also raised risks in low visibility. Pilots had to trust instruments and each other. As the group approached enemy airspace, the first flak burst shattered the quiet. Black puffs erupted around the formation. Flak crews aimed high, targeting the bombers as they climbed through 20,000 feet of cold, thin air. Two planes took direct hits. One lost an engine, the other caught fire. Both began falling behind. Elsie weaved through the bursts, changing altitude and course in sharp, calculated moves. The pilot held steady hands on the controls, adjusting speed and angle to slip past the deadly shell bursts. The B-17's reinforced nose and armor helped protect the crew, but the flak was relentless. Every second in the kill zone was a test of nerves. Inside the bomber, the crew was tense but focused. The bombardier scanned ahead. The navigator checked instruments against the planned route. The gunners tracked shadows in the clouds, ready for fighters. The radio operator listened for updates. Communication was sparse but vital. Back on the ground, the mechanic waited silently by the runway. He had worked long hours to prepare Elsie for this mission, tuning engines, checking control surfaces, and tightening bolts. He called himself the Cow Doctor, after the distinctive spots on the plane's nose. The nickname caught on among the ground crew and pilots. Others dismissed it as superstition. As the bombers completed their run over the target, the flak intensified. Explosions shook the plane. The ground below was a patch of fires and smoke. Despite the danger, Elsie held formation. The pilot's steady control kept them on course. The crew's practiced teamwork kept damage to a minimum. After the bombs dropped, the formation turned back. Enemy fighters tried to break through, but the B-17's defensive guns flashed in the gray light. Elsie dodged attacks, weaving and diving within the limits of the heavy bomber. The plane's armor and the pilot's skill once again kept it intact. When Elsie finally landed, cheers erupted on the airfield. The plane had returned unscathed, while others in the formation suffered losses. The crew climbed out, exhausted but alive. The mechanic's silent watch had paid off once again. The legend of Elsie grew that day. Pilots talked about the plane that fought through black clouds untouched. The ground crew praised the cow doctor who kept it flying. Some remained skeptical, attributing survival to luck. But everyone watched closely, hoping to learn from the bomber that seemed almost invincible. In combat, seconds counted. Elsie had turned seconds into survival. The clouds, the flak, the fear all met with steady hands and precise skill. The mechanic's quiet work on the ground was as vital as the pilot's daring in the air. Honor wasn't just about courage in the sky. It was in preparation, in teamwork, and in the will to return home. Elsie was more than a plane. It was a symbol of survival against odds, a moving target in deadly skies. The crew knew the danger was never far away. But that day, they had beaten it again. The mechanic's nickname stuck. The cow doctor became part of the story, half myth, half fact. For the bomber group, Elsie represented hope. In a war of machines and men, it was the steady combination of skill, care, and resolve that made the difference. The skies remained harsh. The missions continued. But the legend lived on. The plane didn't dodge death by chance. It was prepared for it. The crew fought it. The ground crew built it. That day proved it. In war, survival was won before the first shot was fired. In early 1944, at a bomber airfield in England, orders came down from higher command. The unique spotted camouflage on the B-17 bomber named Elsie was no longer allowed. All aircraft had to use the standard olive drab and gray paint scheme. The special cow pattern was deemed a security risk, thought to draw extra attention from enemy fighters and gunners. The mechanic assigned to Elsie was pulled aside by the squadron's maintenance officer. The message was clear: no more cow paint. Repaint the bomber immediately and follow orders. There was no room for argument. The mechanic nodded silently, understanding the order but feeling its weight. The crew gathered quietly around the plane as the mechanic started work. He covered the bold white spots with layers of dark green and gray paint. His hands moved slowly, almost reluctantly, as if erasing more than just paint. The lively pattern that had once brought humor and personality to the crew disappeared beneath the standard military colors. The airfield, usually busy with the noise of engines and chatter, felt colder that day. Faces were somber. The men avoided each other's eyes, sharing a silent understanding. The cow spots had been a symbol of something more than just paint. They had been a source of camaraderie and hope amid the constant danger. The mechanic worked long hours, covering every inch of Elsie to meet regulations. His movements were precise but heavy, as if the act itself weighed on his spirit. The once cheerful bomber now looked like every other aircraft lined up on the tarmac. On the next mission, Elsie took off in its new, dull colors. The crew sat silently in their positions. The usual jokes and banter were missing. The mechanic, who had worked so hard to repaint the plane, avoided eye contact with the men. The magic that had defined Elsie seemed to have vanished with the paint. During the raid, Elsie encountered heavy flak over Germany. Shrapnel tore through the wings and fuselage. The bomber returned damaged but intact. The crew was grateful to survive, but the loss of the cow paint seemed to symbolize a loss of luck and spirit. Back on the ground, the crew inspected the flak holes. Fingers traced the dents and tears in the metal. The usual light-hearted remarks were replaced by quiet reflection. The mechanic stood apart, watching the plane he had repainted. The men no longer made jokes about Elsie. The playful nickname faded. In its place was a sober recognition of the dangers they faced every mission. The removal of the cow paint marked the end of a small but vital morale boost. The mechanic's hands remained steady as he prepared Elsie for repairs. Yet the reluctance lingered. The bond between man and machine had changed. The bomber was still a tool of war, but the personal touch was gone. The squadron carried on, flying mission after mission. The standard camouflage made no difference to the enemy's guns or fighters. But to the crew, losing their unique bomber's identity was a blow. It was a reminder that individual hope was often sacrificed to strict military rules. The story of Elsie and her cow paint lived on in quiet memories. It was a symbol of honor and the small acts of defiance that kept morale alive. Even as the war pressed on, that brief moment of color stood out. In combat, regulations often replaced personal courage. The mechanic obeyed orders, but the crew knew something important had been lost. The magic wasn't in the paint. It was in what the paint represented: hope, identity, and the will to survive. The war demanded discipline. The airfield returned to its gray, uniform appearance. The men carried on, but the memory of Elsie, with her cow spots, remained a quiet tribute to the human side of war. The mechanic's slow, reluctant hands spoke volumes. Sometimes, following orders meant losing a piece of oneself. The cold airfield and silence told the story better than any words. Elsie flew on, her spirit hidden beneath layers of regulation paint. The men honored her in their reflections, knowing the war was not just about bombs and bullets, but about the small things that kept them going. Months passed. The war continued without pause. Each day brought new missions, fresh dangers, and relentless pressure. The mechanic stayed at his post, working quietly in the dimly lit hangar. He fixed bullet holes in aircraft skins, replaced burned wires, and tightened loose bolts. His hands moved with steady skill, shaped by months of experience. The cow story had faded with time. Once a lively tale told around the squadron, it had become a memory, a half-joke, half-legend. New crews arrived, unfamiliar with the old story. They asked questions, but the mechanic gave short answers. The story belonged to the past now. One night, after a long day of repairs, the mechanic opened his toolbox to grab a wrench. Among the tools, something caught his eye: a small scrap of metal, painted in the cow pattern from the old aircraft. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands. The edges were rough, but the paint still bright. He kept the scrap carefully. It was a piece of history, a silent reminder of the battles fought and survived. The cow pattern had marked that particular plane, linking it to a moment of danger and honor. The mechanic felt a quiet respect for what it represented. Years later, long after the war ended, the mechanic sat in a quiet room with his grandson. The boy listened closely as the mechanic told the story once again. His voice was steady, clear, and measured. He spoke of the missions, the dangers, and the men who flew those planes. He explained why the cow pattern had mattered, how it had become a symbol of courage and survival. The boy's eyes grew wide with wonder. He asked questions, eager to understand. The mechanic answered patiently, never losing the calm tone he had kept through all those years. He wanted the story to live on, beyond the war and beyond himself. As he spoke, his gaze drifted to the past, resting on memories that still lingered beneath the surface. The war had changed many things, but some moments, some stories, stayed with a man forever. The scrap of metal was more than scrap. It was a link to honor, to fear overcome, and to the silent work done behind the lines. In this quiet exchange, the past met the future. The mechanic passed on not just a story, but the weight of history and the meaning of service. The war had ended, but its lessons remained alive in voices and memories. The room was still. Outside, the world moved on. Inside, a story that began with a plane painted like a cow had found new life in a boy's imagination. The mechanic's voice, steady and calm, carried the honor of those who served. The memory was safe. The cow spot paint job never changed the course of the war. It did not save every crew or alter enemy tactics. But for a brief moment, it gave hope to men surrounded by death. This unusual paint scheme started as one mechanic's odd idea. A break from the grim reality of combat. It was a small act of defiance against fear, a stubborn gesture of humanity in a brutal war. The cow spots faded over time. The paint chipped away under rain, mud, and endless sorties. Yet the story lived on. Survivors passed it from one to another. With every retelling, the edges softened. The colors dimmed, but the meaning stayed clear. This story is about ordinary people caught in war. Men who tried anything to survive, to find a moment of levity amid chaos, to hold on to something that felt like home. The painted spots became a symbol, not of victory but of endurance. The mechanic's hands, stained with oil and paint, stand for more than maintenance work. They remind us that hope can come from the simplest acts. A brushstroke on metal was a small light against the dark. In a war defined by machines and tactics, this moment shows the human side. Fear was constant. Honor demanded sacrifice. But so did the need to find life in death. The cow spots did not win battles, but they won something else, proof that even in war, small acts of hope survive. They connect us to those who lived it, fought it, and remembered it.